From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Charles Lister, the Director of MEI's Syria and Counterterrorism Programs, and today we're going to be talking about Syria's spiralling economic crisis and what it's likely to mean for the country and perhaps the region going forward. In recent days, the Syrian pound has crashed to as low as 3,200 per one single US dollar, sparking unprecedented economic uncertainty, the shuttering of small businesses, and for the first time in years, anti-regime protests in the Druze majority governorate of Sweda. Recent data indicates that roughly 85% of Syrians now live in poverty, and with this current crisis worsening, it's hard not to imagine that number rising yet further. As corruption, organised crime continue to impact Syria's economic prospects, we've also witnessed a very public crackdown on Syria's wealthiest businessman, Rami Makhlouf, whose financial clout arguably kept the regime afloat over the past 9 years. While subsidies continue to decline and a weak crisis lies on the horizon, the US government is just days away from activating the Caesar Act, the most aggressive set of sanctions yet to target Syria's regime. From June the 17th, Washington will be legally mandated to sanction any entity worldwide, friend or foe, that invests in regime-controlled areas of Syria. To discuss this and more, time depending, I'm thrilled to introduce three members of the Middle East Institute's newly launched Syria program. Sam Dagher is an American Lebanese journalist and author who's lived and worked in the Middle East for more than 16 years. As the only reporter for a major Western media outlet based full-time in Damascus from 2012 to 14, Sam was briefly detained by Assad's security services, held in an underground prison and later expelled for reporting unfavorably to the regime. Sam currently writes for The Atlantic and was previously at the New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor and AFP. His book, Assad or We Burn the Country, is a must-read. Danny Makki is a Syrian analyst covering the internal dynamics of the conflict in Syria and specializing in the situation within regime areas and in Syria's relations with Russia and Iran. Danny has worked as a consultant to The Atlantic and reported from Syria for the BBC, Channel 4 News, NBC, and The Telegraph. And Karam Shaar is a Syrian originally from Aleppo who specializes in Syria's political economy. After participating in Syria's early protest movement, he fled the country and is now based in New Zealand, where he works as an independent consultant and a senior analyst at the New Zealand Treasury. Sam, Danny, and Karam, thanks so much for joining us today and welcome to the podcast. Karam, let's start with you. What, in your view, are the drivers of this recent economic deterioration in Syria? Has this been a long time coming, or has there been some recent development that has accelerated or even started the events and the developments that we're watching?
I actually believe that next to the Caesar Act, there are basically four main drivers to what's happening at the moment in Syria. The first is the deteriorating economic outlook in Iran, as the country is struggling to sell its oil after the reimposition of sanctions from the United States. This has actually affected the regime's finances to Hezbollah and Assad regime. So this is the first factor. The second factor is COVID-19 in Syria itself. Even though the government has handled it really poorly, it did actually impose some restrictions on movements and some factories were not able to operate. The third factor, which I believe is very important, is the economic crisis in Lebanon, which is actually also affected by the Caesar Act. Syrians have massive deposits in Lebanon. In fact, some studies estimate the number to be around 40 billion, while the amount of deposits in Syria's banking sector, I estimate to be around only 1 billion. This is the third factor. And the fourth factor is the Caesar Act and the spat between Rami Makhlouf and Bashar al-Assad, which I actually believe its impacts are a little bit exaggerated.
Okay, and just to follow up on that, I think you mentioned Russia and Iran and Hezbollah in particular. I mean, is there anything that Assad's primary to international allies can actually do to assist or to ameliorate this condition? Or is this something that's very specifically rooted within Syrian territory and the economy itself?
I actually believe that Russia and Iran can do very little to help Bashar al-Assad. In fact, I actually think that Iran is willing, but it can't, while Russia might not be even willing to begin with. And also comparing the economic support of both countries, I believe might be inaccurate. It's more like comparing the Dead Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. Iran has actually helped the Assad regime by as much as $40 billion, while Russia, according to some analysts recently, has helped the Syrian regime by simply $3 billion, and this remains in the realm of just speculations. So I do not think Iran is actually able to help the Syrian regime anymore. They are facing their own troubles back home.
So moving on to Danny, from where you stand, how are ordinary Syrians living these days amidst this crisis within regime areas, and how are they responding to the escalating crisis? I mean, assuming that this lasts, or even that it worsens, looking more broadly, what does this actually mean for Syria and specifically for Assad going forward?
Well, these are very, very unprecedented times for the Syrian economy and the Syrian people in general, because what we're witnessing is a scenario which we haven't previously seen in the 9-year-long conflict, where we're having Syrians from most of the areas suffering economically in a way which hasn't been seen before. So this is not just ratcheted up the pressure and the intensity towards the Assad government and the government policies, but what it's also done is just raised a whole new bar and threshold of critique, which we haven't kind of seen before. And a lot of this is due to the hardships which people are facing on a local level. You know, when you've got people who are actually starving in the country, who are trying to find money just for bread, for daily necessities, when state salaries remain at around 50,000 Syrian pounds per month, but that doesn't really get you by 2 or 3 days, let alone rent and other daily kind of and important necessities. So what we're seeing is a population now facing the full hardships of a combination of factors, as Karam stated, including Lebanon and including COVID-19, sanctions, to a lesser extent, I would argue, EU sanctions, and the corruption, which has effectively created this kind of economic monster just eating the country to pieces. I mean, it's not just a currency issue, it's more of a deeper economic problem, which really has no way of ending, and there's no clear pathway to a solution for it because it's endemic. How do you start to fix Syria's economy? That's a question which you can't answer at the moment because you have a multitude of problems, but no solutions. There's no real coherent way you can see this ending. And from a popular level, you could argue it's created what I would call a silent majority within the country of people seeing the economic situation, and that ultimately is going to have a very important significance on the idea of political allegiance. Because the economy today is a very crucial facet because people rely on incomes, they rely on money to feed their children. If that goes, then political allegiances will start to change. And we've seen that happen over the previous period where some people have become more critical of the government. They're starting to see the situation as becoming very desperate within the country, and they're looking for ways out potentially, either leaving the country, legally or illegally. What we're witnessing is had the potential before COVID-19 to create a potential second wave of migrants to Europe. COVID stopped that to an extent because of the lack of travel. But if that clears up, we could possibly see more Syrians leaving the country than ever. I mean, a lot of people I've spoken to on a personal level who have been happy in the country have now stated they want to go to Germany or Europe just to get out of the country, to have some opportunities and to have a way of having a dignified economic life, which isn't there for them in Syria at the moment for numerous reasons. When people were struggling to buy cigarettes or mette, the prices have been increasing by huge amounts, going from 300 to 1,500 within the space of 2 or 3 days with regards to mette or cigarettes. And remember, these products are very basic. They're not the imported products which they were used to before the conflict. So it's quite a desperate situation, which is getting worse with every passing day. And unfortunately, there's no real end in sight on the general public kind of context.
Right. I mean, it really does seem hard to understate the significance of what's developing now. And Danny, just to follow up to you before we come to Sam, I mean, it does sound from what you're saying like the people living particularly in regime-held areas are increasingly sort of coming to the conclusion that many of those deeper-rooted long-term problems, the corruption, the poor government or mismanagement, and just generally the cost of having sustained a 9-year conflict, are the core reasons to blame for the crisis that we're watching play out right now. But presumably, with the Caesar Act coming just in a matter of days, presumably the regime will try to shoulder the blame on that. I mean, A, is that happening already? And B, do you think that will make a difference in terms of public perception?
Well, the Caesar Act domestically was very unknown in Syria till about 1 week ago or 10 days. So probably at the start of this month, it's really started to be a known factor or a race to get as much information on the Caesar Act as possible, which puts it into consideration when you understand this has been going on for about 2 years. So it's strange that people don't know enough about the Caesar Act to know what's coming their way. But it's irrefutable that the decision to implement the Caesar Act later on this month has really hit Syria like an earthquake. And what we've seen is day after day, just the pressure, the tension, the concern is starting to rise. And this won't affect Syria on a day-to-day transactional level with their allies who could probably find ways out of it in some sense. What it's really going to hit is the psychological element. It's going to hit the confidence in what remains of the confidence in the Syrian economy, which we've seen. And this will be translated through the rise in the currency, the problems happening internally. If you look at the pharmaceutical sector within the country, all of a sudden medicine is no longer available in most of the places. And in the worst times in the conflict in Syria, especially in government and kind of regime areas, there was never an absence of medicine in the peak of the fighting in 2013, 14 and 15. So we're seeing it really impact different parts of society and different parts of economic life. And what's important to remember is right back in October, the currency was still relatively stable. But now you've got such a mix of volatile factors that we don't know exactly in what direction this is going to go. So it's creating a pressure cooker atmosphere within the country, which is starting to resemble 2011 kind of vibe. It's starting to look like that situation is re-emerging, but in a different kind of way, with protests in Sweden, rallies in Tartus and Latakia and other areas, but a general sense of disgruntlement with the current situation. At the end of the day, the economy, the economic situation poses a far more dangerous threat to Damascus and the government than the military situation does, which can be dealt with in a security kind of way. The economy can't be. The economy needs a genuine strategy, a plan, a way of getting out of sanctions, a reprieve, which just isn't present at the moment. So whoever's in the country are probably looking at this in a long-term perspective, thinking this is going to go on for a long, long time. So where is the victory in the sense that, when will the suffering end? When will the phase where we can kind of come back into a semblance of what we had before 2011? And at the moment, there's no clear answer. It's just a list of additional questions.
Right. So Sam, moving on to you. So with the Syrian economy so clearly under such extraordinary pressure, we have seen the crackdown on Rami Makhlouf, a consequential figure in Syria who you profiled extensively in your book. Just wanted to ask you what you think Makhlouf's downfall really represents in Syria. Does his removal strengthen the regime? Has it opened up doubt and confusion within the business community? And how do you just generally see that move? What does that move really mean within this whole broader context of a quote unquote military victory, but clearly now the suggestion of internal tensions within the regime itself?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's great to be on here with everyone else. Yeah, I mean, I would actually agree with some of what Karam said earlier about, the spat with Makhlouf, overstating its impact on the economy. But actually, it's hugely important in another way. It really chips into the support base of the regime, because you have to remember, I mean, this is his cousin. he's long been described as his money man. He's somebody who has been put in that position by Assad himself. I mean, a lot of people forget that. When Bashar al-Assad came to power in 2000, he effectively inherited power from his father. His cousin was chosen as the person who was going to help him engineer an economic opening that would benefit and enrich the family and its cronies first and foremost. I mean, he was put in that place specifically by Bashar al-Assad, and he was removed by Bashar al-Assad, or sidelined or downsized, however you want to put it, when he no longer was seen as serving the interests of Bashar al-Assad, or the family first and foremost. But I think, of course, Rami has, by the sheer fact he was in that position, he built his own support base. He built his own patronage network within the Alawite community. I mean, this is the backbone of this family, of this regime. Let's remember that the Alawites almost sacrificed everything so that this regime can remain in power. They bought into this idea that they were not only defending Bashar al-Assad, but they were fighting for their own existence. The idea that if the predominantly Sunni opposition or the rebels win, then this would be the demise of the Alawites. Obviously, also resurrecting the ghosts of what happened, under Hafiz al-Assad in the late 70s and 80s, and the whole fight with the Muslim Brotherhood and the other elements of the opposition that emerged during that period. So they practically sacrificed everything, and they were expecting to reap the fruits of the so-called victory, this narrative that they've been sold by the regime, that we withstood uh, a global conspiracy and we prevailed, and now we're moving forward to the phase of reconstruction. So what's happening now guts this whole narrative. I mean, shreds it into pieces. Yes, Makhlouf, I think, is important in what I just described earlier. Removing him really cuts into the support base. I don't think the regime can afford discord within the Alawite community at this very sensitive juncture, when the economy is in tatters, when you have protests in Sweden, which, by the way, you know, are chanting for the ouster of Bashar al-Assad. They're saying Syria's free, Bashar out. They've protested at the beginning of the year with economic grievances, but they were not chanting against the regime. And this is the first time they're doing it in a few years. I mean, there were sort of protests with anti-Assad slogans, I think, back in 2015, perhaps in Sweden, or 16. But these are the first ones, since then. And I've spoken to one of the activists organizing this. He's based abroad, but working with people on the inside, and he told me that they're liaising with people in Tartus, the predominantly Alawite coastal area of Syria. They're liaising with people in Salamiya, near Hama, the Ismaili minority. They're liaising with people in Dara. That's where it all started in 2011, and also we're seeing people in Idlib watching at what's happening in Sweden and supporting it. So really, I mean, all of this is coming, as you said, in this really difficult period. There are, we're told, other people now, other cronies that are perhaps going to fulfill the role of Rami Makhlouf, but it remains to be seen whether this lineup of new businessmen, people like Samer Foz, the cousins of Asma al-Assad from the Dabah family, another fellow called Yasar Ibrahim, and the Katerji brothers. I mean, it remains to be seen whether these people can fulfill the role that Rami played in terms of helping the regime evade sanctions, launder money through Lebanon. But obviously, that's not now going to be very difficult. The Lebanese financial system itself is in a state of collapse, and as you mentioned, the sanctions, pursuant to the Caesars Act. So it's really a moment of reckoning, I would say, for the regime in many ways. Karam and Danny mentioned that there are few options for bailout of this regime at this stage. Will Iran step in? Will Russia? I mean, Russia obviously has not committed the same financial support that the Iranians have provided this regime. But who's going to bail him out? The options are limited. I mean, we may see a violent crackdown on some of these protests that are now emerging. We could see him perhaps resorting again to escalating in Idlib because that could, you know, distract from the economic woes. So it's really a tough moment for the regime.
So, Sam, just to sort of track back to something that Danny said, which I thought was interesting. Danny said or suggested that that the current economic crisis in Syria might potentially pose more of a threat to the regime and its own sort of internal integrity than the military challenge that it has or currently faces. And I just wondered, Sam, you were in Syria in some of the most intensive conflict years that we've seen since 2011, and I just wondered what your perspective was on that. Is an active military challenge to the regime a more or a less significant threat when compared to a total economic collapse, which I think is what we're watching play out right now, and the prospect of internal divisions within the regime's highest circles?
I think definitely a total economic collapse coupled with this discord that we're seeing in the inner circle. I mean, that's definitely a much more formidable and serious threat for the regime. I mean, the regime views it that way. If you go back to the protests in 2011, the peaceful protests were the most dangerous thing for the regime. People coming out on the street and facing bullets and tanks and saying, we're committed to peaceful protest. We don't want to bear arms. We want to bring down, this regime by peaceful means. But the moment the regime had the opportunity to move it into I guess the place or the territory where it's most comfortable, which is a conflict, a confrontation, a military escalation. I mean, this is what it knows how to do best. I mean, it's configured to do that, to survive in this sort of crisis mode by provoking a military escalation or confrontation, which is what the dad did in the late 70s, early 80s. But this is now, I mean, a complex set of challenges. It's not only the economy, it's not only coming from the outside. The patrons on whom uh, Bashar depends, to survive, are not perhaps not willing to prop him up or not going to be able to prop him up. So the options are limited, and you have this rift in the inner circle, and you could even say it's a rift in the Alawite community itself potentially, because the Makhloufs are pretty prominent. They belong to a powerful tribe. You could see if the economic situation deteriorates, Makhlouf could say to people, "Look, I warned the regime. If they came after me, that this would happen." I mean, obviously, uh, drawing the links and saying, the economic collapse is happening because of it, because of they had gone after Makhlouf. I mean, that's quite tenuous, but of course Makhlouf will use it to his own advantage to try to rally people around him. So it's really a very complex set of challenges that the regime faces, and I would say even more complex in 2011.
Right, right. I suspect you're probably right. And there's going to be a lot of important things to be watching. So we've flown through a lot of time, but I will hope to ask all of you the same question and get if it's possible, relatively brief response back. But it's a tricky question. I think gathering from the discussion we've had, clearly what we're watching play out now is hugely consequential. And Syria as a country, as a nation, and the regime itself is going to face extraordinary challenges in the coming weeks and months. So I guess my question to all of you is, what happens next? Is this the point at which the West can step in and offer some serious, meaningful negotiations, I assume with the Russians? Is this the point at which the regime doubles down, ends up cracking down even more forcefully on more of its population to enforce its rule? I guess there are a million ways this can go, but just interested. Well, I guess we'll start with you, Karam. We'll go in the same order we started with, but just interested in all of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the answer to this question was in the question itself. I kind of feel like there will be one of two outcomes. The first is a famine, And unfortunately, we do see the signs of that starting to happen already. People selling their organs, wheat, like shortages in wheat, apparently are also just around the corner. Unfortunately, this first possibility might be more likely. I feel that countries, when targeted by sanctions in authoritarian regimes, tend to be much more belligerent, and this could very well happen in Syria too. The other outcome is for this whole regime to collapse. The anger is just unprecedented, and I actually totally agree with Sam. I believe what happened over the past couple of months to the popularity of this regime was much stronger than what happened over the first 9 years of the conflict.
Thank you. That was an important answer. We'll move to Danny.
Well, I think we're going to be facing a period of absolute economic destruction, volatility of the Syrian currency. It's going to keep rising and then falling. I mean, it's going to be unstable for a long period of time. And without any reprieve, I can see the Iranians and the Russians not really having a genuine investment or bailing Damascus out. So what I can see is an economic collapse augmented with seriously deep socio-political fragmentation on a level we haven't really seen before. It's going to be unprecedented. It's going to be a very difficult period. And ultimately, an economic collapse would not necessarily mean the collapse of the Syrian government, which is quite a bad thing in hindsight, because if it can continue to go on with the current situation with the economy, this is going to have really terribly negative consequences for the economy short term and for a potential refugee crisis. I think that some things have been made over these last couple of months which cannot be unmade without significant concessions. A deal with the US and the EU is just not on the agenda at the moment, because protests in Sweden were treated with a response of rallies in Tartus and other areas and mobilization. So if we're going back to the phase of mobilization, who's to say this wouldn't continue for another 9 years?
Gosh, okay. And Sam?
Yeah, one thing struck my attention was something that Ambassador James Jeffrey, the special representative for Syria, said on June 8th. As the Caesar Act was passed, he said, I mean, he dangled sort of an out to Bashar al-Assad. He said to the effect, change your behavior, don't bomb and gas your people, get Iran out, and then maybe we can talk. But I think that's not going to be enough for the Syrian people, because if you look at what's happening both inside and outside the country, I mean, outside the country, you have already 1/3 of the population, 7 million. They want justice and accountability for everything that this regime has committed so far, all its crimes and atrocities. We're talking about more than seven. I mean, now the numbers that we're getting, at least 700,000 killed. Uh, the country largely destroyed. It's going to take 350 billion to $400 billion to rebuild the country. People who are still in jail, in prison, in regime dungeons. So I think, yes, the U.S. and the other power brokers in Syria would probably want to move this towards some political settlement, but I think both the Syrians outside and now the Syrians inside, because they're the ones suffering at the moment, and they're the ones who are actually risking their lives by coming out on the street in places like Sweden and protesting. I mean, is it going to be acceptable to them that this regime somehow we find a way that we keep Bashar al-Assad in place, and we maybe bring a couple of figures from the opposition into some sort of a coalition government? I doubt it. I mean, the West, and I think the United States and Europe, and to some extent Russia and the others may be aiming for that outcome, but I don't think it will be good enough for Syrians.
Right. Sam, Karam, and Danny, time is up. I think we could probably talk about this for a lot longer. But thankfully, MEI's Syria program will be covering all of these developments as they happen. As I say, we're going to have to leave things there for today. But thank you very much all for joining the program. And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's podcast. We'll see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.